Hi, I'm Pastor Marilyn from Forsyth Presbyterian Church and Ukirk Campus Ministry at Mercer University.
And I'm Pastor Joseph from Culpeper Presbyterian Church. Welcome to our Lenten sermon and discussion series on the story of Joseph found in Genesis chapters 37 through 50. And while we recommend using either the Common English Bible or the New Revised Standard Version for this series, you can use any translation you like. Comparing different translations is a great way to gain greater insight into Scripture. Pastor Marilyn and I will start the discussion, and then y'all will take over in your small groups or in the comment section of these videos.
But before we go any further, it's really important that we give a content warning this week. The story we are dealing with today concerns sexual harassment and assault, as well as victim blaming. If you need to take a moment during the video or even skip this lesson altogether, we certainly understand, and we think it's important that you do what makes you feel comfortable and safe.
Absolutely, friend. This is an important topic to cover within a faith context, but these issues can also bring up past trauma. So please be kind to yourself and to one another. We're talking about Joseph in Potiphar's house. So how did we get here?
Well, we started with an overview of the events of the Joseph story, a dreamer with a fine robe who gets sold into bondage in Egypt, then rises to prominence due to God's presence with him. And from his position of influence, he is able to provide for his family, even the family who betrayed him, and eventually reconcile with his brothers. We also talked about our own connections to this story and how it's an exploration of a family drama, and other themes can be instructive for us even now.
Then we took a closer look at the family drama with a close reading of Genesis 37, examining the actions of the brothers, especially Reuben and Judah, and the repercussions for the rest of the family. Today, we're continuing this practice with a discussion on Genesis 39.
Chapter 39 has a clear outline. Verses 1 through 6a tell us about Joseph's rise to power within Potiphar's house. The narrator tells us explicitly that Joseph succeeds as a direct result of God's presence with him. Not only does the narrator tell us Joseph succeeds with God's presence, but the source of Joseph's success is even apparent to Joseph's Gentile master, Potiphar, who recognizes the power of this Hebrew servant's God with Joseph. Thus, Genesis begins to reveal to us, the audience, how God will keep the promise made to Abraham to bless all the families of the earth through Abraham's family.
But in the second half of verse 6, the objectification of Joseph begins in a rare scriptural description of physical appearance. Interestingly, the narrator uses the same words to describe Joseph's appearance as were used to describe his mother Rachel, which you can find in Genesis 29:17. Commentators do not address whether these Hebrew words, when used to describe Joseph, intentionally communicate either a particularly effeminate or youthful appearance. Yet I think it helps the modern reader to know that just as his mother was objectified and desired for her physical appearance, so now Joseph shares the experience of all who possess physical beauty and are objectified for it. But while Rachel appears to return the desire which Jacob felt for her, Joseph does not want to be with Mrs. Potiphar.
Mrs. Potiphar approaches her desired liaison from her position of power. She does not speak sweet words, and she doesn't play seductive games. She issues an order: lie with me. With the imperative, she strips Joseph metaphorically of all the power and responsibility he has received within Potiphar's household. And she reduces him to an enslaved object who she expects to acquiesce to her will. Before we consider Joseph's response to Mrs. Potiphar's proposition, let's consider his position. Joseph has received unwanted sexual advances in his workplace from a superior. Despite all the responsibility he has in Potiphar's household, he now faces an incredibly difficult position. As we will see, Mrs. Potiphar's command carries with it an implicit threat: give me what I want or else. Joseph finds himself in the position of all enslaved persons whose bodies have been exploited sexually by those who claim ownership of them.
Additionally, Joseph in this chapter acts as a biblical #MeToo. Regardless of whether or not Joseph reciprocates Mrs. Potiphar's lust, he has no way to win. If he gives her what she wants, he betrays his own moral code, the trust of his master, and his God. If he does not, he opens himself up to unwarranted punishment, further degradation, and like anyone inappropriately propositioned in the workplace, no guarantee that the implicit or else threat won't be carried out anyway.
In one of the longer speeches of the narrative, Joseph explains his reasons for refusing the liaison. Potiphar has placed his trust in Joseph, and Joseph does not wish to betray that trust. Additionally, because Mrs. Potiphar is married to Potiphar, to lie with her would constitute adultery and a sin against God. Psalm 51 gives us David's own confession of his crime of lying with Bathsheba and his subsequent murder of her husband Uriah to cover up his own adultery. And in that psalm, he names his sin as a sin against God. Against you, O Lord, have I sinned. Thus, for both Joseph and David, adultery is not only a sin against a fellow human, but a sin against God.
But Mrs. Potiphar, like most predators in positions of authority, does not accept the answer no. And for an undetermined amount of time, Joseph has to be careful about where he works, when, and who is around him when he does. Many people know the deep unease of such a situation where the only protection from unwanted advances is the unpredictable presence of other people, who many times do not know that they are serving this shielding function.
All this tension comes to a head in verses 11 through 20. One day, Joseph is left vulnerable without a shield of other people's presence. Mrs. Potiphar literally snags her chance and physically assaults him. Joseph, partially stripped, flees the encounter only to be accused of rape. His foreignness acts as a strike against him. He is not given the opportunity to defend himself, and although he likely begged and pleaded, once again, the narrator throws him into a pit without letting us hear his anguished cries.
Finally, verses 21 through 23 show us that despite his wretched and imprisoned state, God does not abandon Joseph. Instead, God continues to work blessing through Joseph's hands, even in a foreign land, even surrounded by Gentiles. And the chapter closes, the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. God does not intervene when Joseph is attacked, falsely accused, or wrongly imprisoned, but God remains with Joseph, working blessing through the things Joseph can control through Joseph's hands.
Biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, writing in 1982, treats this entire episode as largely allegorical. Joseph the righteous wisely avoids falling into the arms of Lady Folly and demonstrates the challenge of all Jews living in a Gentile land and under the influence of a foreign empire. While this is a perfectly acceptable reading, it strips this powerful story of its immediate application in lifting up, naming, and seeing the very real suffering of the blamed victim, the sexually harassed, the objectified, and the silenced.
One of the points that I often like to make about Scripture is that its story is our story as the people of God. Jesus' incarnation wasn't a symbolic gesture. He really became part of the human condition and could identify with our suffering on a personal human level. For folks who are survivors of sexual harassment, sexual assault, or false imprisonment, this part of Joseph's story can help them identify their struggle within the context of their faith tradition. So while an allegorical interpretation might be helpful to folks like Dr. Brueggemann, I also want to hold on to the lived experience of people who are still too often victimized in these ways. In the United States, 1 in every 33 men will experience an attempted or completed rape, making Joseph's experience far too common even in the 21st century. And that although it happens to a man in this story, this kind of violence happens far and away more frequently to women. 1 in 6 of whom will experience an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. Now, if you're among these 1 in 33 or the 1 in 6, your identity is not defined by your experience of violence. It is defined by the steadfast love God holds for you.
This chapter is a resource for survivors of sexual harassment and assault. And the term survivor should be used instead of victim to intentionally recognize the agency that was taken from survivors in the assault they experienced and survived. The power for survivors, including Joseph, in this biblical story lies in the fact that God remains with Joseph through it all. After the harassment, the assault, the victim blaming, and the wrongful imprisonment, God's chesed, God's steadfast love, loving kindness, and covenantal loyalty continue to be with Joseph even through all he has suffered. Although God's chesed appears frequently in Hebrew scriptures, the only time it gets mentioned in Joseph's story happens immediately after Joseph survives. The gospel for all survivors, for our entire world, comes to us in the word of unbreakable love after unconscionable assault. God still sees Joseph as someone through whom God can and will work, when others saw Joseph as an object or a tool for their own use. When others saw Joseph in this way, God sees Joseph as God's beloved child. God makes Joseph a partner and brings God's blessing through Joseph to the place where Joseph lives and works. Potiphar recognizes the blessing, but did not participate with Joseph in the work of bringing it about for his household. Joseph prioritized his relationship with God over what might have been convenient, expedient, or even safe. And even after he has been harmed and might feel damaged, God remains steadfastly loyal to Joseph. Mrs. Potiphar prioritizes her own desires over Joseph's humanity. But even when cast into the second pit of the story, prison, to Joseph, this innocently imprisoned man, God is tenderly and graciously faithful, a presence of which Joseph may be unaware, but that will hold him in good stead throughout bitter times.
Phew. Deep breath, y'all. The Bible has some heavy stuff in it, and thank you for being kind to yourselves and to one another as we wrestled with one of those passages. Next time, we get to check in on Joseph's brothers as they come to Egypt in the midst of a famine, and how Joseph tests them to see if they have changed in the years since they conspired to kill him and instead sold him into bondage.
Now we're going to pass things off to y'all, discussion groups, or to continue your individual reflections so that this conversation can continue. We study scripture together so that we can get a fuller picture of what God is doing in the text and what God is doing in the world around us.
We're entering this story together to grow as disciples. And so we encourage you not to think of this as a source of set or definitive answers, but as a starting point for your own exploration. We encourage you to share any questions you may have, both with us, either by reaching out to us or leaving something in the comments, and to share those questions with one another as well.